It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Versatility is a double-edged sword for this Chicago Bears offensive line because it can give you some great value out of your backups and really getting the most out of your roster spot, but it can also be a temptation to move players around maybe a little bit more than you should. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook or join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. Don't forget to check out the Locked On Bears full YouTube channel as well for all of our video content to go with the podcast. Continuing our Chicago Bears training camp previews today, moving on to the offensive line. It's been a position of particular focus for us on the podcast this offseason, but now is the time to really dive into this upcoming right tackle competition. Really, I think the most open roster competition for a starting spot on the team. I mean, between that and one of the cornerback spots, that's about it for like open job. Anyone can go get it. It's your opportunity to grab a hold. So we'll get to know the candidates a little bit more and try and figure out how the competition should work with three potential guys rotating in there and only so many snaps to go around, plus all of them dealing with some pretty stark competition on the other side. It makes it a little bit trickier to get a good sense of who belongs in the starting lineup at training camp. We'll talk a little bit more about that starting lineup too as we move forward, the importance of keeping those guys in some of those spaces and now some new guys in some new spots and where these pieces just might all fit together and why the Bears need to get that figured out sooner rather than later. And we wrap up with kind of more of a broader look at the depth on this offensive line and some of the versatility of guys both competing in the starting lineup and guys on the bench. The Bears seem to have some real faith in some of their younger developing players up front, and there's some advantage to that, and there's some risk and some potential disadvantage for that as well. So we'll kind of get a full encompassing look at really what is going to be maybe the most important group on this Bears offense this season, outside of perhaps quarterback, of course, is always going to take the cake, but offensive line is going to be absolutely critical for either one of those Bears quarterbacks. And for me, that starts with this right tackle competition. You can circle it right away as potentially the weak spot. When you don't have a fully established, locked-in starter, you're hoping that one can really sort of emerge out of this group. Everyone can already pencil in Germain Ifedi as your potential starter at this point. He was the starter at the end of last season after Bobby Massey was injured, and Ifedi moved from right guard to right tackle and played better there than he did on the interior and put together, 5, 6, 7 games of pretty decent tape down the stretch that make you wonder if maybe you have something there. It's a matter of that result, the more recent result compared to his track record in Seattle, which was, first round pick pedigree, started out at guard, struggled a little bit. They tried moving him to tackle and struggled a bit there. And the thought that when he came to Chicago was that he would step in at right guard and kind of replace Kyle Long of sorts at that spot. Then, of course, has to bump outside. And he really wasn't playing as well at right guard compared to what we started to see at right tackle, which was average right tackle play, but still exceeding expectations, but not as good as right tackle could be for your team. But you cut Bobby Massey in the offseason, and you start to have to make some changes up front and start to get comfortable with what you have. They signed Elijah Wilkinson from the Denver Broncos, played quite a bit of right tackle there, but he was never the guy that they really wanted to commit to full-time in that starting lineup. He was typically coming off the bench, filling in for injury and doing all right, but they always kind of wanted better. And there's a reason they never really went into a season saying, yep, Elijah Wilkinson is our guy. most of his time at right tackle. I believe he played a decent amount of right guard as well. And then there was even a game or two where he had to flip over to left tackle and fill in there. So he's got some potential value there that we'll get into in a moment here. And the last guy, Larry Borum, the 5th-round pick out of Missouri. I would call him the underdog of the group. There's a lot to like about him coming out of Missouri. Big-bodied guy, maybe projects a little bit more inside to guard, but could be involved in this right tackle competition as well. We've seen the Bears have some success with 5th-round picks in recent seasons. It's been kind of a Ryan Pace pedigree, so understandably, you can find some room to be a little bit excited about Borum as well. Another guy, primarily at right tackle at Missouri, but started games at left tackle, filled in at left guard, and also played some right guard as well. So there's some different spaces you might be able to find him in, even if it's later on in his career as this Bears offensive line maybe changes more and more over the coming seasons and how they end up shuffling some of these younger players around. But for me, I'm going to be curious to see how they work this with the lineups and the snaps. You have your first team, your second team, and your third team at training camp practices. And typically you don't want, there's not room to get all 3 players first team reps in any given practice. You can rotate a couple of guys in with the ones, but if you start spreading it too thin, you're not seeing a very large volume, not a lot to work off of on a day-to-day basis. So presumably those guys are probably going to go in that order, is Fetty with the 1s, Wilkinson with the 2, and Borum going to start with the 3s. And that's when you sort of watch day by day. Does Wilkinson start getting some 1s reps after a few practices? Does Larry Borum start bumping up to the 2s and Wilkinson down to the 3s? Or does Borum get up to the 1s? Or is Fetty pretty much getting most of the 1s for a while as training camp goes? That's how we'll be able to measure this competition more so than a lot of others, and how they split those reps specifically. 1 spot, 3 guys, 3 levels, how they rotate them in and out. It can be a little bit difficult to gauge when they're going up against Khalil Mack every single day at practice. I can't imagine if Fetty or Wilkinson or Borum are going to look good lining up against him in every practice. So there's some positives and negative there where it is a good test and it is going to challenge them quite a bit, but then it can also be a little bit hard to see success and consistency in the progress that you might. And maybe that's where the 3 preseason games are going to come most in handy, is to see them play against guys that aren't future Hall of Fame, perennial Pro Bowl edge rushers lining up against them. It's a good problem to have if you're the Chicago Bears. But for me, it speaks to this larger need of needing to solidify this offensive line combination early and get everybody locked in, know your talent, know where they belong, and then start building some of that continuity. Because we've seen in years past, when you start moving things around, how much of a problem that can be. So we'll try and put some of these guys in some spots and look at how you can build some of that continuity at training camp into the regular season next on Locked On Bears. I would bet we're going to see some shuffling between now and week 18 of the NFL regular season. It's not something you can actually lay some money down, but there are plenty of other ways you can play and win some real cash at betonline.ag, the number one place we recommend and the number one place we trust. Because it's the middle of July, football season still months away, and you can already bet in so many different ways for this upcoming season. Not only the Bears win total, will they make the playoffs, Matt Nagy for coach of the year, where the Bears will finish in the division, all that fun stuff, but offensive rookie of the year for Justin Fields. We keep seeing the odds bump Fields down more and more. Now he's tied with Trey Lance and Zach Wilson at plus 1,000, way down the list of offensive rookie of the year candidates. And it's a great time now, before we get to see these guys and before the national people start catching up. This Bears team better than a lot of other people, and you can use that to your advantage at betonline.ag. Sign up today for a free account and use our promo code LOCKEDON to receive your free 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. The one thing that really has bothered me about the Bears' offensive line struggles in recent seasons, and you've heard me get fired up about this on the podcast a little bit before, because it really just rubs me the wrong way, because offensive line is so important and because of coaching, and we'll get into that in just a moment, is when the team seems to get guys in the wrong spot and then have to adjust later on and move guys around. And you never have like a full season of a lineup really getting comfortable with where they are supposed to be. It's happened frequently with Cody Whitehair and James Daniels playing center and guard back and forth for the last couple of seasons. It really feels like every year of James Daniels' career at this point, it's been the injury or half the season at center, half the season at guard. And it's not really doing your own players any favors. So for me, for this Bears offensive line, the number one thing I want from training camp is to figure out your starting lineup really as soon as you can. We've seen the Bears dabble, flirt with free agent offensive tackles this offseason. Morgan Moses was in pursuit, ultimately decided to sign somewhere else. There's still a veteran like Russell Okung out there if the Bears wanted to sign a veteran left tackle. Reportedly, that was the plan for Moses, was for him to play left tackle and then move Tevin Jenkins back to right tackle, which again bothers me because why has Tevin Jenkins been playing left tackle this whole time if you were still looking at adding another left tackle and changing your rookie's responsibilities, 2 months into the job? Even so, if you're going to make the change, make it now. Don't sign a veteran in mid-August, 2 weeks before the regular season starts, or 3 weeks, whatever, and make everybody adjust and change then. Like, if you're going to make a late change like this, make it now, because the later it goes, the less time all these players are going to have to prepare. And I'd be on board for signing a veteran tackle if that's what this team wants to do. I think you can always use more offensive line depth because it's so critically important. It's why I love talking about the position, because not only is it huge for the quarterback and the running back, it's both the passing game and the running game, but sometimes it's easy to forget that like the offensive line is 5 of your 11 positions. Like half of your offense is those guys. And it's so critically important to be talented, to have half of your offense be a talented, consistent group. And as soon as you start moving guys in and out, it becomes a lot more difficult for them to be comfortable in their spot and really, truly know the guy next to them through and through. And it's not about being good buddies and pals with the guy next to you. I mean, sure, that's what you would want in an ideal world, but it's like, it's a physical thing. It's a muscle memory thing of not just your muscle memory of knowing, okay, if I'm the left guard, how do I go back in my stance and use my hands independently, and where am I supposed to put them, and that type of muscle memory, but also sort of learning the muscle memory of the left tackle next to you and the center on your other side. And when those people start changing, you have to sort of relearn that, because you want it to be instinctual. Let's put in the context of Cody Whitehair last year, moving to left guard and playing at a much higher level at left guard than at center, moving next to Charles Leno and learning how Charles Leno reacts to certain pass rush moves. If you have, say, a slide protection to the left where, Whitehair is kind of going out for even farther left with Leno, whether if there's a blitzing guy on the edge and he knows he has to pick up the next farther guy inside, or if he's sort of there as a double team of sorts to help on a edge rusher over on the edge, knowing exactly how Leno is going to set up his pass sets and be able to physically feel how far away that is. When he's out there, is it a full arm's length away? Is it half an arm's length away? How much do I have to move my feet to get over there? How quickly is Leno going to be able to move back inside? And you can't measure that, and you can't really represent that in any other way than just feeling it and being able to sort of feel that physical space of, okay, here's how close I need to be to my left tackle to help there. Here's how close I need to be to my center to help out there. And being able to find that happy medium is not something that you can just step in and do right away. That's why I feel like it's almost like learning another person's muscle memory to then apply your muscle memory to function as one cohesive and collective group. And so that's why I say, if you're going to put Tevin Jenkins at left tackle, leave him at left tackle. If you're going to put James Daniels at right guard, leave him at right guard. If you're going to start Sam Mustipher at center, stick with that. Don't get halfway through training camp and say, you know what? We really want to put James Daniels back at center, and then we'll put, Jermaine Ifedi at right guard, and then pull up Elijah Wilkinson at right tackle and shift things with 2 or 3 weeks left in the season, because it's bad player management. It's not putting your players in the best position to be successful. And it really, I think, reflects poorly on the offensive line coach and the coaching staff as a whole, trying to learn their guys. Obviously, injuries are out of your control, and you have to adjust and adapt. And we'll get into some of those different possibilities here in a minute, as far as where the depth is and where the shuffling might go, but you need to have that continuity and that consistency for all of those guys to get used to each other. And so that also for me applies to the right tackle competition. I know you want to have a thorough opportunity to see Ifedi with the first team, maybe see Wilkinson with the first team, Borum, and get a number of practices under your belt and maybe some preseason action as well to say, okay, we for sure know what we want to do here. I'm willing to have some patience there under the guys that you get it right the first time when you do lock into some person. But the sooner you can figure that out, the sooner then James Daniels, presumably at right guard, can learn his right tackle and all those different continuity and muscle memory and spacing and communication and all those different things that you need as an offensive line that just take a lot of time to really build strongly. There's a reason why even last season, as the Bears made offensive line changes, it wasn't the first game when they moved Cody Whitehair to left guard and then moved Jermaine Ifedi to right tackle. The first game they did that, I think, was against the Packers right out of the bye week, and they struggled, right? It took weeks for that offensive line to really hit its groove, and that's what I'm talking about here, where it's like you can't just do that quickly. And so for me, it too often becomes an excuse that we hear. It's like, well, the Bears offensive line, they're still getting to know each other, so that's why they were struggling at some of these points in the season. It's like, well, they're, it's new guys and they just got shuffled around. But when it's not injury based, which last season injuries were a factor in there, and I'm willing to separate that from sometimes just having the wrong guys at the wrong position. When it's not based on an injury and it's just you have to make a change because somebody's being too inconsistent, for me, that means you didn't prepare well enough. It means you didn't operate well enough from the beginning, and it just means you didn't know your players well enough to know where they are supposed to be and where they can be at your best. And the coaches themselves say it all the time, and I truly believe that their job is to put your players in the best position to be successful. And shuffling them around and getting them in different spots unnecessarily without some sort of outside force or factor of injury or suspension or some other thing that takes a player away, that's a real problem. That's not putting them, maybe it's eventually getting them into that best position, but a good coach gets them in the best position to be successful right away. I guess I would rather that they admit their mistakes and move guys around when they need to find that best spot and get them there eventually, but I would rather them get them there the first time, get it right the first time, and give yourself an offensive line that can open things up for David Montgomery in this running game. Hopefully then keep the quarterback upright and have the better running game, make the quarterback's job easier. So much of this offensive success is going to revolve around these five guys up front. And we think we know who four of them are going to be. We're pretty sure Jermaine Ifedi is probably going to be the five, but let's lock that in as soon as possible and not play into these nonsense games of moving these guys around and making literally everyone else on the offense's job more difficult. I will be curious to see what the depth chart ends up looking like, though, especially outside of the starting lineup, because it's not a very experienced group of backups, and they're kind of hard to pin down. It seems like the Bears have a lot of confidence in some of their younger guys, but we'll start to figure out who these backups are and where they might slot in and what the Bears would do if there was an injury up front, because there's potential here for a lot of moving parts. Next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode also brought to you by our great friends over at BuiltBar.com, making you the world's best tasting protein bar day in and day out. And I mean day in and day out for me in my life. Actually, literally 30 minutes before I sat down and did this podcast, cracked open a salted caramel Built Bar. Oh, it is the perfect, mid-afternoon sweet little treat. It's a nice dessert too, but I like to kind of spread it out for myself a little bit more in the day because it tastes like a candy bar, but it's healthy. It's got all the nutrients of a protein bar. Low calories, low sugar, high fiber, and high protein. All covered in 100% real chocolate, soft, easy to chew, and you can't go wrong with any of their delicious flavors. They have a mixed box where you get to try them all. I have tried every single flavor, and I have not had one that is not delicious. Again, salted caramel was my choice today. I love the raspberry. I love the coconut. I love the cookies and cream. I promise you will find something you love. Head on over to BuiltBar.com and enter our promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. I try not to spend a lot of time talking about backup offensive linemen because it's not necessarily a group of household names on any team. But as we kind of learned last year, I mean, we talked about going into last season, offensive line depth was a concern. It was something I was trying to keep in mind on this podcast plenty, and not trying to rail on it every day. Offensive line depth is not something that always is going to affect you, but we were kind of saying that if the Bears start having injuries up front, you might have some trouble in there. And so then we see the Rashad Coward experiment try and fail in a few different ways. Alex Bars comes in and plays 3 different positions and struggled at least a few of them. And part of that is what we just talked about with you bring a guy in and can't seem to find what spot he's supposed to go in. As an offensive line coach, you need to know your players better than that. We get, what is it, Latavius Simmons, or was it Arlington Hambright? I get the two mixed up. Getting in and playing like meaningful snaps as a rookie 7th-round pick. Offensive line depth was an issue last season, and still kind of an issue when you look at the backups on this roster. It's a lot of the same guys minus Jason Spriggs. Like, you didn't really add much other than the guys all competing at right tackle, but everything else is kind of the same cast of late round picks and undrafted free agents. And I think there's enough there with the guys competing at right tackle where I can feel okay about what they have there. Certainly, you won't have as large of COVID concerns this year, presumably, assuming more and more players continue to get vaccinated as the league encourages a lot of that moving forward. But it's kind of a weird spot where what happens if you have an injury. And there's certainly something to be said for the young guys. I mean, Alex Bars slowly making progress in his career. And a lot of those guys were thrown into the fire in an impossible situation last year. So I'm not ready to say like, well, Bars played poorly last year, so he's never going to be anything good. Or Arlington Hambright didn't play very well last year, so he's useless. I mean, no, I'm not. The jury is still out on a lot of those guys. It's just when they are unproven, they do often get thrown in the fire, and that's a very difficult spot for any offensive lineman, even if you're a veteran. But when you're unproven as well, it's kind of a recipe for disaster there. So you got Alex Bars, Dieter Iselin, Latavius Simmons, Arlington Hambright, young late-round pick, undrafted free agents. Bears have had success finding a guy like Sam Mustipher out of that type of a crop. So I'm willing to be patient with some of them. Maybe practice squad is a little bit more likely for more of those guys than not. But the fact that the Bears haven't opted to bring in more veterans seems to be an indication of some trust, or at least optimism, for a little bit more progress when it comes to those guys up front. But as I look more and more at this Bears offensive line and what this might look like this upcoming season, it feels like the right tackle competition here is where your backups are going to come from, kind of no matter how that plays out. Because when we went through those candidates in the first segment today, all of them have played guard. Some of them have played left guard. Some of them have played left tackle. So maybe that's kind of where your offensive line depth comes from. Presumably, Jermaine Ifedi is going to be your starter. Let's operate under that assumption for now, but you can kind of mix and match these names as the versatility has kind of played out. But if Wilkinson has started games at right guard in his career, so if James Daniels gets hurt, you could presumably plug Wilkinson there. Larry Borum started at right guard in Missouri. I mean, you could plug him in there. Left guard, Borum played some of that. I don't think Wilkinson has played NFL left guard, but he has played some NFL left tackle. It would be a difficult swap for a player to not only go from tackle to guard, but then from the right side to the left side as well. So there's some challenge there. I think the big thing is center right now. If Sam Mustipher is your starter and gets injured, there's not really another backup on the roster that has any sort of notable center experience. So then if Mustipher gets hurt, you're either moving James Daniels over from right guard or Cody Whitehair over from left guard. And yeah, that'll get you by at center. But what I don't like about not having a true backup center is at that point, you're impacting 2 positions instead of 1. So say Mustipher gets hurt, even if it's a minor thing, but it's in the middle of a game and you have to make a change there, you're taking your right guard out of position and putting him at center and then bringing someone in at right guard. And not that you're making 2 positions worse, but 2 guys are adjusting, and so they're not going to be as comfortable for all those reasons earlier that we talked about, comfort on the offensive line, and then it disrupts the players around them that were used to whoever was in that previous spot, and it can kind of have a little bit more of a ripple effect to disrupt 2 spots as opposed to 1 where player comes out and player comes in, and it's still an adjustment for everybody, but you got 4 other guys that are in the spot they've been comfortable with for the last however many weeks it had been up to that point. So, you have guys that can fill in at any spot. If any of your 5 linemen get hurt, you've got some kind of backup in Wilkinson or Borum that has some experience at those spots that can fill in where you need them to. It's just not necessarily a lot of experienced, consistent depth in a way that would be ideal. But this was an offseason of financial limitations that kept the Bears from doing a lot of what we might consider ideal. And it does seem like offensive line is where we're a little bit more in the realm of getting by and it being more of a longer term rebuild there with now young players at least 4 of the 5 spots. Borum is sort of the 5th one there as a young player developing, but in your lineup, Tevin Jenkins, Cody Whitehair, James Daniels, and Sam Mustipher all within their first, 5 years of their NFL careers. This is not a make the offensive line drastically better in 2021 plan, but a build the offensive line with younger players over time. And that means it's going to take a little bit before this line reaches a little bit more of its full potential. But I'm excited to see how a lot of these young players start to develop at training camp. It's a big reason why Matt Nagy is such a big fan of Juan Castillo and how he teaches these guys and all those different things. And that's what we need to see more of this upcoming season. You can be sure we will be keeping a close eye on all of the big guys up front at training camp. So make sure that you subscribe to the Locked On Bears podcast to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. We haven't been full 5 days a week in a couple of weeks here, but looking at my calendar, just next week, we are ramping back up to our full 5-day-a-week slate, and you will be all set and ready for training camp. So make sure you are tuning in every day, getting all of the Bears talk you can, whether it's in the regular podcast or on our YouTube channel. I appreciate everyone who's stuck with us through this offseason. And I hope more than anything, the Locked On Bears podcast has helped make it just a little bit easier for you to bear.